Alrighty, so I'm going to explain pressures, membranes, and mechanisms that make negative pressure ventilation possible. So we're going to have pleural membranes. So the lungs are going to be enclosed by these visceral pleuras, and then there's going to be pleural space in between them. So here's the lung. It's going to be encapsulated in very small layers as well. And then there's going to be pleural space, and there's going to be another layer. The space between these membranes contains a small amount of fluid that reduces friction and helps the lungs actually adhere to the chest wall. So these are a cross-cut of our ribs right here. Another mechanism is going to be just exhalating. So this is a passive process where the diaphragm is actually going to press up. We're going to exhale because our lungs are going to collapse a bit. Our muscles are going to relax. It's going to reduce volume, which also increases pressure, pushing air out of the lungs. Another thing is going to be pulmonary pressure or intrapulmonary pressure. So during inhalation, the diaphragm is then going to contract and flatten, which is going to cause the muscles to expand the rib cage up. Expansion will increase the volume of our cavity here, which is also going to decrease intrapulmonary pressure, the pressure inside the alveoli, below atmospheric pressure. And since pressure goes from high to low, air from the outside air is going to go into your lungs. Let's see, next question is going to be, describe what pneumothorax is and how it occurs. So pneumothorax is when air enters the pleural space. So when air gets in here, because this space you want to be more or less empty, because we want it to be able to do all the things it needs to with either filling up more or having more pressure, having less pressure, depending on the volume of our lungs. And so if air makes its way in here, it's going to disrupt the negative pressure, which will then cause the lung to collapse on itself. This can be, related to different trauma like wounds or just spontaneous rupturing. But pneumothorax basically means that there's a loss of negative pressure in the lung, which is going to cause the lung to just collapse in on itself. And then we're going to end up with a lung that's very, very sad. And it's going to be hard for it to expand because we don't have that negative pressure anymore. What next? We have, what is surfactant and how does a lack of surfactant impair ventilation? So surfactant is this, forgot what it is. It's like a protein substance that's going to be produced by our alveolar cells. And it basically reduces surface tension within the alveoli. So we have our alveoli, and they're going to be sort of like this, if I can draw it. And so our alveoli are going to have this thin layer coating around them of this surfactant. It's going to be all around here. And so what it does is it reduces surface tension within it, and it'll prevent the actual collapse by decreasing the forces because there's going to be water molecules lining all around the alveoli too. And so this decreasing the surface tension is going to allow the lungs to expand, allow these things to expand during inhalation. Lack of surfactant, so like premature infants will have not enough surfactant. They won't have a lot of surfactant because it's one of the last things that a fetus creates because they don't need lungs when they're in the womb. But the absence of surfactant then increases surface tension in the alveoli, which makes them prone to collapse. We know from Laplace's law that pressure equals 2T over R, where T is going to be our surface tension and R is our radius. And so if we have the same radius in these things, but we increase the tension is going to increase the pressure by twofold, because for every increase in tension, times it by 2, let me just write it out. pressure equals 2T over R. And so if our tension increases by, let's say, 10, then our pressure increases by 20, which is going to just require more pressure to actually keep these things open, thereby, we're just not really going to be able to have that ventilation, that inhalation. They're not going to be able to breathe that well. Question number 2, or not 2, but next question I should say, is explain how CO2 is transported in the blood. Describe O2 transport in the blood as well, and include a description of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve and factors that influence the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. That was a lot of words. So CO2 transport, O2 transport, and then the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curves. Okay, so CO2 and O2 are going to be sort of similar. And it was transported in the blood? Yeah. So CO2 is going to be transported in 3 major ways. One is going to be 70%. The other one's going to be 23%. And the last one's going to be 7%. And this is going to be CO2. Now, 70% of the CO2 that is transported in the blood is actually going to be transported as bicarbonate ions. So we don't actually have it as CO2 in the blood. We have it in the form of bicarb. There we go. But it's going to be formed from the reaction that has CO2 plus water, which turns into H3O and, HEC. Jeez. Thinking of chemistry right now, but it's going to turn into HCO3. There we are, and then hydrogen. And so this reaction is what's going to have most of our CO2, because our CO2 follows this reaction along, turns into bicarb. That's where 70% of our CO2 is. Now about 20%, 23% is going to be binding to our hemoglobin, forming carbaminohemoglobin, but it's just going to be in our hemoglobin, in our blood. And then the last 7% is going to be dissolved directly into our blood. So this will be in our plasma. And so that's how this that's how carbon is going to be transported throughout the blood, is in these 3 different ways. Oxygen, on the other hand, that's what it wanted, right? Oxygen transport, yeah. So oxygen is going to be transported really in hemoglobin in our red blood cells. And there's going to be 2 different ways. One of these ways is going to be 2%, the other being 98% of our oxygen. Now, the 2% is going to be just in our plasma. So about 2% of our actual oxygen is going to be dissolved in our plasma. But the other 98% is going to be oxyhemoglobin. So each hemoglobin is going to have these 4 chains, and they can bind up to about 4 oxygen molecules. And so about 98% of our oxygen is actually bound into our hemoglobin in our blood. And so the dissociation curve here, give me 1 second and I will get back to you on that curve. So there's this curve, and it's called the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. And basically what this is it's going to show saturation and then oxygen. And so our curve, a normal curve, is going to look something like this, with 40 being right about here, I think. So this should be about 40 millimeters of mercury, and this should be about, I think it's 75%. And so we have 2 different shifts we can do. We can either have a right shift, which is going to be to the right, or we're going to have a left shift, which is going to be to the left. Now there's different factors that can influence the curve. This one's pretty simple, pretty easy. A lot of things, as when they increase, will shift the graph to the right. So if we have an increase in, let's do temperature. If we have an increase in hydrogen atoms, so I'm just going to put decrease pH, because that's what that means. If we have an increase in CO2, if we have an increase in the 2,3 2,3 BPG. So these are all factors that are going to increase or shift the curve over to the right. So these shifts basically say the oxygen is going to be more readily released to active tissues when they need it, while still allowing oxygen to come to the lungs when they need to be. For the left shift, it's going to be sort of the same thing, just everything decreased. Now, what was the last part of the question? How do these factors affect the curve? Oh, these factors affect it by shifting it either right or left. And include a description of the oxygen curve and factors that influence the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. One of the things that increases the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is oxygen. So if hemoglobin, because we know we have these 4 little chains here, they're all deprived of oxygen, then they're not really going to be, there's not going to be any like affinity for oxygen. But as soon as one of these gets some oxygen on it, it's going to increase the affinity of these 3 to have more. And once the second one does, then these third and fourth ones are going to have even more increased. And the third is going to increase the fourth one even more. And that's how that works. So oxygen can increase hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen just by being present. And yeah, that's going to be everything for question 3.